our imagination and our inner world is hyper real. It just simply is. And, the way I see all of the digital creation, being made is that we are turning the inside of our brain into the outside representation in one way or another.
You're listening to the Futures Podcast with me, Luke Robert Mason. On this show, we meet the scientists, technologists, artists, and philosophers working to imagine the sorts of developments that might dramatically alter what it means to be human. On this video episode, we meet Bionic pop artist and futurist Viktoria Modesta. Now, I had the pleasure of interviewing Viktoria in 2016 at the Victoria and Albert Museum as part of the London Design Festival. What struck me then was her unique design sensibility, one informed by a desire to playfully interrogate what a posthuman aesthetic might conceivably look like. Her imaginary futures filled with cyberpunk, sci-fi, and pop cultural references present environments that feel oddly familiar, but are entirely alien. By combining landscapes, soundscapes, and bodyscapes, Victoria's work has the unique ability to make audiences question the limits of human morphology, and often the very limits of nature and reality itself. So Victoria, I've always seen you as someone who truly embodies the transhumanist ideal of morphological freedom, because at the heart of your work there seems to be a desire to craft new identities, new bodies, and more recently whole new realities. So how, and I guess why, has this always been so central to your artistic practice?
Well, it's interesting that you bring up the transhumanist sort of like ideology, because to be honest, the deeper that I got into my work, the more I sort of started realizing that I'm not as close to the whole transhumanist sort of ideology as one might think. And there's a really big factor is that, a lot of the explorations that I have kind of, adventured with have really stemmed from some quite kind of deep human needs and desires, and or even something as simple as feeling like the things that are happening are simply not fair, for example, right? So there is a humanistic kind of approach to me that that has kind of felt really important, and I'm still kind of exploring exactly what my relationship is with the more generalized transhumanist idea. But I do know, and that there is, there is some kind of a more romantic, poetic kind of feeling that I get when I think about, this idea of morphing yourself and the world around you, with the powers of technology and science, for example, and it's probably stems from my first ever visits to the MIT Media Lab, for example, and realizing that every single person working there, their medium is different, but the process that they go through creating something and exploring is exactly the same of a fashion designer or a person who's working in some sort of any kind of like cultural sort of expression, and it hit me that we're the fields of creation are not as different as people tend to think, and they don't cater such different sort of things in us than we think they do. There's things have been sort of pushed into categories, art is for enjoyment and inspiration, technology is for consumerism or tools, but that's not actually kind of the case in my experience. I think when you really sort of look at it and observe it all and take it all in with a sort of a non-judgmental eye, you kind of start to see that, it's just that's how things have been purposed, but that's not really the case. so with that in mind, I think that, I have a kind of a really sort of beautiful kind of vortex of feelings about all of it. And that's kind of what I'm trying to express, really.
Well, you're living amongst that vortex. I mean, the transhumanist ideology is problematic. I think when people think of morphological freedom, they think of faster, better, stronger enhancement. But in actual fact, there's something slightly more nuanced happening there, which I guess you explore in a lot of your work, which is an exploration of difference, the multitude of possibilities through which humanity can express itself. And it's always felt like really that's at the core of your interests.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head, and I think there's a certain kind of aggressive strive to kind of maximize, and just sort of live forever, live longer, and all of that stuff. And and I think, like, for me, I'm completely inspired all the time by the cycles of life and the natural world, and even the idea of death. There's like everything dies at one point. Stars, galaxies, people, animals. And I'm definitely interested in certain levels of spirituality that come with it too, and you know and so there is like a level at which I feel like we see eye to eye, and then at one point it kind of loses me, because I feel like it defeats the point. And some of the technology that's kind of actually like highlighting the possibilities of how in the future we could be interacting. For example, being able to have an AR or VR experience with someone that has passed away, or your child or whatever. Like just this idea, when you touch on like an emotional streak with technology in the future, I'm just like, this whole idea that you become, somehow you get rid of these sort of complicated emotional qualities of humanity when you advance with technology. I find it kind of vulgar. Like I feel like it is vulgar, because for me the experience has been very different. Understanding that my body doesn't sort of end to who I am, and where I start, where I finish. Having to delve deeper, and understanding, well, if I'm not just my body, then where do I exist and who am I? It's forced me to explore such kind of deep, interesting layers of what it means to be human, that the idea that we just need to become more, the productivity level and our abilities is the main goal of advancement, sort of feels primitive to me in some way.
You've really spent time sort of using, I guess, your body and your aesthetic practice to showcase multitudes of ways in which we can be. And I guess it's been almost 5 years now since our last long form interview. And that was really focused on your personal story and the exploration of the idea of post-disability. But since then, you've really continued to hone those design sensibilities with the body at the core of that. And I think that was most clear in your recent collaboration with Rolls-Royce, where I think you said you became the personification of a machine. So what can you tell me about this work and how it sort of influenced your thinking about your performative practice?
I mean, there's always different qualities to the work that I do. There's personal sort of personal kind of goals and explorations that I want to do, but also it's like I'm always thinking like 100 miles ahead of where we are right now. But at the same time, the physical work that actually still needs to be done in order to create historical kind of little milestones is still really important. So, I've I've had various kind of ups and downs with, should I continue working with prosthetics and tech wearables? Is it representing the sort of advanced kind of version of things that I'm imagining? And to me, the answer was kind of yes, because without that work, people won't be able to kind of sort of see the little steps in evolution that was happening. And the project with Rolls-Royce was really interesting, because um, I get really, really fascinated with the energy that people are able to generate with non-biological sort of creations, and cars are really the manifestation of that, and of course, we're very different, but I love the idea of how just it's like the most condensed, energetic sort of thing that we've been able to put into like a non-biological item. And so when I started thinking about the Rolls-Royce car, it's like the first thing that sort of struck me is, let's exist in parallel universes where I am the car, and
Yeah.
I am representing this kind of human spirit that is a machine that is actually in human form. And just from a creative perspective, it was so fun, because I got my most badass creative team, around the campfire, and was like, okay, what are the possibilities? So, we just continued working with energy, and apart from kind of 3D printed fashion and the art direction, we did actually invent some stuff. Like we created the smallest Tesla coil that, sparked and powered, inside of my limb, which was also really kind of symbolic for me. This idea that, you can have really quite dangerous sort of energy running, inside of your body, which is probably, in reality, not much different from the energy that's already within our body, biologically. I felt, um, it felt really kind of beautiful to draw the connection between the man-made and the artificial and the body in a kind of a way, that wasn't so separate from us. And many people interpreted it in different ways, but it was definitely, I don't know, it's definitely super fun and different for us.
Well, as part of that campaign, as you just said there, you created the world's smallest Tesla coil and housed that within your prosthetic limb. And folks looking at that may go, well, you did all of this work to create this thing, this physical object. Why not just use CGI? And I guess, Victoria, with all your work, why is it so important for you to actualize your visions out in reality, out in the physical world?
Oh my God. You're like, that's exactly, I mean, yeah, that is the question, I would make my life a lot easier, going down the CCG route. I mean, it's interesting. Just very recently, I've talked to a couple of people, and that really pointed out that, the idea that I am real and that I'm a real person and I'm doing these things in reality just brings a completely different level of emotional engagement. And I think that is probably the most important thing for me. And this is why, with all of my access to new media of, augmented virtual reality characters and all of that stuff, I have kind of carefully danced around it because, you know, for me, it loses touch, looking at a lot of sci-fi right now, this idea that anything is possible with sci-fi, but then it's like, but what does it really make you feel like? you just, I think there's something about us that, knowing that it's just computer generated doesn't really engage in the same way. And, and also, I do think that, my work in the post-disability space, however I tend to sort of go hot and cold about it, is it defiant of, my life's work? Is it not? It's kind of tricky one. But, with that in mind, I think that there is a specific sort of language and execution that is very specific to me, and and I do believe that if you're trying to communicate any kind of message to your audience that is somewhat challenging any of their kind of ideas or perceptions, then you do need to create a real narrative and a real story that's connected to the real world. And so it's kind of it's catch-22. And so and I am right now really exploring the virtual and the CG stuff, and and I have really mixed feelings about it, because one of my biggest questions of like opportunities of creating an AI clone of myself or a digital avatar is, how do I make the digital Viktoria feel like she is, and it's something other than just a drawing, just digital drawing. And I think that is really important. And in a way, I don't make it easy for myself. A lot of my projects that I execute take 6 months, sometimes a year to bring to life, and it's and quite expensive too. Because we're working with experimental technology in a way that's, you really, I really had to find the most brave people out there in the industry who's never say no. They're like, all right, we're gonna try it. So it's there's a lot of reasons. There's a lot of questions. Why do I do that? But at the same time, I have to say that the more I am in this space, the more I'm kind of understanding that the kind of specific slice of culture that I'm in is really important, and everybody else is rushing ahead, creating whole digital sort of lives in games and all of that kind of stuff. And I think that, someone still needs to focus on understanding physical life, augmentation, and a kind of possibilities and identity, and the digital, because I fundamentally don't believe that in the near future we're going to have super fulfilling lives without a physical body. And also, going maybe just touching a little bit on spiritual or psychedelic kind of experiences. Something that happened for me is, I had a near-death experience when I was a child. I was 7 or so, and I had a clinical death. And, and I have some memories of that. And I just have these memories of just having having a visual, but not feeling anything in my body at all, and not kind of having any human experiences. And later on in life, I had some psychedelic experiences, which, which kind of also kind of reminded me this feeling of like, okay, you can have an awareness of yourself in some kind of capacity without the physical body, but, we're here and this is our vehicle right now, and it's not clear whether we're ever going to have this experience again, having these all kinds of feelings that feel really raw and imperfect, and sometimes scary or uncomfortable, whatever. And because of that, I think that it's really important to focus on, how our physical body and our sort of conscious mind get to have experiences simultaneously.
There's certainly a relationship there that we're still yet, I guess, to understand. When you think about consciousness, the question is the body there to generate consciousness? Is it emergent property of the mind, or is consciousness something that's received from outside of us, and all the body acts as is a form of radio antenna into some form of collective consciousness? I mean, these are questions that we will constantly grapple with, and it feels like we will only be able to authentically grapple with them through artwork. And in creating these performative promises, these are the ways in which we can really ask questions about what it means to be, what it means to live, and what it means to change those things as well, and try on new bodies and new identities. And with some of your prosthetic work, I guess, how does it feel for you to be so responsible for that vision of the future? Because from the outside eye, folk point at Viktoria Modesta, the performative promise, the character, the embodiment there, and go, this is the future cyborg, this individual, this image, this thing that I have found on the internet on Google image search when I type cyborgs. This Viktoria Modesta is the representation of what I believe the future human will be. And Viktoria, I know you as a squishy, normal human being. You're this artistic individual who has this kind of performative identity, which offers a promise out into the world. So I guess, how do you deal with having those two parts of your life, and having the responsibility for being what people perceive to be the quote unquote future human?
I mean, it's a little bit of a head trip, to say the least. And I'm really grateful that there's a certain shift that's kind of happened in my life, in my personal life, which is where, the kind of disassociation and the thing that I started doing after I moved from Eastern Europe, and I started engaging with a kind of art community and subculture and stuff like that. It's important to say that I really, a lot of that stuff was really kind of came to existence because I felt deeply kind of rejected by the normal world in such a strong way. I almost ended up at a children's home, right, when I was born. And the thing is that, I didn't actually realize that that's what I was doing. I genuinely felt like, okay, so I don't want to be the person who I was born to be. So I'm now just going to create, and I'm just going to be the creator of this vision and this person and this style. And and I think that probably a couple of years ago, I think when kind of the Viktoria Modesta that I did create reached a certain level of kind of recognition, or something you could say, I really started feeling like that is kind of actually not me. Like, it's a very important part of me, but it is also, that is my canvas. That is the artwork that I create. That is the ideas that I realize, coming to life. So it was probably the most greatest thing that could have happened was really for me to start feeling like, there is the creator and the project kind of all existing within the same person. And to be honest, what it really did is it allowed me to start thinking about the world a little bit more in a wider scope, and the impact of Viktoria Modesta on, popular culture or subculture, or whatever you want to call it. And that's been very interesting, because you know, one of the things that I am considering is, really sort of like giving potentially birth to this digital Victoria that's going to come alive, and sort of with a similar kind of relationship. And I think so. There's it's kind of complicated on a more practical level. It's a love and hate situation. You know, um, kind of feeling like you've invented something and you're the best reference for something is fantastic, but also equally just so lonely,
Mm.
like for like a decade, I just felt like the only person remotely doing what I do. And it's changing slowly. It's changing slowly. And I think that probably the closest feeling of kind of community that I felt was pretty just more recently, just feeling that uh, creative people who are, working in the digital space are probably the most closest type of folk to me, really.
Mm.
Where it's idea that you create, you change the narrative and culture with visual art, and so that's been really great. But I also think that the work is not done.
Yeah.
Like I've I've broken through quite a few important milestones, but I also, there's quite a few more places where I think Viktoria Modesta, the bionic pop artist, can make an appearance. And I think I'm still uh, kind of honoring that and working towards, you know, making that happen. So I don't know.
Well, that image of the bionic pop artist has been pulled by you from the future into the present and has become such I guess, cultural icon of what it means to potentially have a post-human existence. And I guess my question is, what inspired your visions for this form of aesthetic? How have you been influenced by avant-garde fashion, by burlesque, and by sci-fi? How have all of these multiple influences filtered through your mind to give us a very unique vision of the future?
My references have been kind of somewhat broad. When I was younger, it was Disney and MTV and Hollywood movies. Very much that. And the story was always very quite similar.
Mm-hmm.
The character often felt that their idea of reality, their idea of their body, or their circumstances just did not match the person that they felt that they were,
Mm-hmm.
and ultimately became sort of the heroes of their own story, and changed it not only for themselves but for other people. So love it or hate it. I think that being a little girl, watching Little Mermaid, probably had a really, the biggest impact, really. And I think by the time I was, my teens, and I was in the subculture bubble in London, uh, the more avant-garde art and characters that were around me were really the inspiration too.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm very kind of like um, a bit old school in that way, where I loved the idea that of how people just dedicated their entire lifestyle and sense of fashion and identity and how they conducted themselves based on a specific cultural belief. I think that
Mm-hmm.
fascinated me, and so, but also, I remember being kind of, um, 15 or so, and watching kind of Matthew Barney and Alexander McQueen, and being extremely inspired by the fact that you can just through visual art, you can just transform, you invoke so many strong feelings in someone. And it's like, and it's not really defined, right, what those feelings are. It's just these
Mm-hmm.
feelings of possibilities, just expansive possibilities, this kind of personal power that you have somehow, that, and but the biggest thing that really kind of rattled in my head at the time was, I don't want to be the muse. Like, I
Yeah.
don't want to be the girl going in the shoot with some creator, like making her. It was really important for me to be my own creator and to, construct these different sort of imaginary scenarios and characters in a way that, kind of, the ownership was really important. And ironically, ownership or identity, this character ownership is something that's really important right now. It's really coming up all over the place, with stories of women going to the fancy, avatar studios, paying several dozens of dollars to get a scan of themselves or whatever, and then fighting for the rights to have their digital, version of themselves. So, I think that, and on a broader scale, should we be allowed to be anyone we want on the internet without the transparency required for people to know that you are, you're experimenting, and this is, it's really interesting. So, in a way, everything that comes up has been coming up for the past year in terms of the kind of identity issues that are happening and questions. I'm kind of shocked that I just intuitively was exploring a lot of these ideas so early on. Like, I didn't know what it meant, but I knew that it was important. I knew it was going to somehow really have a really strong impact on our future lives. So I don't know, one of the different things about me that I've learned from the academic circles, for example, is that sometimes the rationale behind some of the things that I've been doing maybe isn't written down or explained in a particularly sophisticated manner, but it doesn't take away from the idea, and the things that kind of I'm questioning in a way.
And I've heard your work described as retro-futuristic cyberpunk informed by 80s and 90s visions of the future. But for you personally, what do you feel your aesthetic is? What is unique about the way in which you present this version of a future?
I mean, it's really important to say that my idea of the future isn't universal, and I definitely don't claim to do that. I think that my aesthetic has been about collecting all of the different parts of the culture that I ventured into, and keeping the things that I felt were really important to me, to be honest. And I definitely can say that I'm like a cultural explorer. I mean, I really, really, from the young age, from coming to London, just love the idea of test driving, understanding what motivates you to be in a certain way. And it's interesting you brought up burlesque, for example. I've kind of never had anything to do with burlesque really my whole life, other than sort of having kind of the appreciation for the most distilled, old-fashioned version of femininity. There's something about that I found, I'm like, interesting. And as a person who's very diverse in my sort of masculine, feminine sort of energy, it was something that I really kind of appreciated. But so, it is a combination. And I think that when people read my sort of background story or whatever, they can kind of pick up little puzzles of different pockets of different things that I did. And, so I guess, the answer really is it's more just, authentically wearing your experience, and I think that's a thing that I find really important. but that is also the thing that doesn't really exist in culture too much
Mm.
anymore. And it's a little bit more of an old fashioned way of thinking, unfortunately, because, back in the day, you couldn't wear a leather jacket with studs if you weren't an actual punk, you just couldn't do that. And culture is very sort of disposable, and it sort of comes down like that. So I don't really know what that means, to be honest. I don't know exactly what that means to the future of us, but I do feel like my aesthetic has been extremely diverse, and my references have been really diverse, um and I'm just doing that thing, and trying to be as broad-minded about it as possible.
There does feel, though, that at least in the last decade, there's a bubbling up of this new aesthetic language for the future. And it's been expressed in the sort of media that we're beginning to see on TV and in film. It's in the visual language, I guess, of TV shows like Black Mirror. It's in the music videos of Janelle Monáe and the filmic work of Alex Garland, who's most well known for Ex Machina. And it's in the short films of Spike Jonze. And I guess it's been the last 20 years that Spike Jonze has been playing in this kind of aesthetic space, and of course in the photography of a collaborator of yours, Jora Francis. It does feel like there's an aesthetic turn here, and I just wonder how perhaps you would describe this synthesis of almost sci-fi imagery and how it presents itself in our everyday reality.
I mean, I think that it's extremely important that we keep exploring that, because and the thing that's being explored here really is when we gain control over so many different aspects of our visual identity, it's like, what do you do with that? I very often turn down interviews or talks that focus on body positivity, because I have I sort of represent two sides a little bit, right? On the one hand, it's like kind of be proud of who you are, and kind of and sort of like own your identity or character that's might not be seen popularly in culture. But at the same time, I'm extremely pro being your own architect and changing your body in whatever the hell kind of way you want, So I'm a little bit on the fence, and I do believe that some of these aesthetics are kind of trying to visually capture similar things. It's like, what part of the raw humanness do we keep, and which part do we want to sort of augment and kind of visualize as somewhat being influenced by digital technology, and there isn't a right and a wrong answer, in this situation. But so it's and it is tricky, because there's a level of sort of surrealism that appears, that and obviously in more pop culture there's a lot of negative feelings around that, and this idea that there's a lot of encouragement of people sort of changing themselves for peer pressure and things like that, and it's I don't know, it's a really kind of tricky part, because I personally get really inspired by the ability of playing around with your image and your physical body, because why shouldn't you? That's kind of like the only thing that you own ever in life, So I don't know. It's there is the references that you mentioned. There's definitely a certain kind of aesthetics, and I do think that it's a lot of it is very much just us trying to get our head around what does our reality look like when, when we are advanced with technology, and when, but retaining some kind of human qualities. I think, I think that's where it sort of lies. I do think that it's a very interesting space, and for me personally, now that I have, I feel like I've executed quite a lot of those specific projects, I'm now exploring bringing in a little bit more of the human back into it, and pushing the digital elements through some other areas.
Well, it does feel like there's a slippage. There's a slippage between the virtual and the real, because the aesthetics of virtual environments bleed their way into your artistic practice, and people look at the thing and go, is it real? Is it virtual? Is it CGI? What part of this is actual, and what part of this is virtual? And the fact that they can't tell, and sometimes what they think is virtual is actually is interesting in its own right. And I guess then it becomes an issue of how do we deal with living an everyday reality partly through screens in hyperreal environments, and then having to deal with the fact that we are then returning to quote unquote real environments that are very disappointing in comparison to the, I guess, Instagram realities and digital realities through which we could choose to spend our time. And this idea of the virtual and the real bleeding back and forth, I guess, kind of became clear when we had the LA fires. I think that was last year, and everybody was comparing that to the orange glow inside of Blade Runner. And of course, your work, your spike prosthetic limb, that's inspired Blade Runner aesthetics. It's inspired SpaceX and much more. And I guess, what sort of responsibility do we have when we walk that tightrope between creating these provocations and then finding them present themselves in actual reality? The line between fiction and reality, sci-fi and reality is so porous in the 21st century.
It is super porous, and I mean, also, time is telling right now that, we as humans, like, our imagination and our inner world is hyper real. It just simply is. And, the way I see all of the digital creation, being made, is that we are turning the inside of our brain into the outside representation in one way or another.
Yep.
And so I think it's important to note that, that is part of being human, is this idea, even in the most ancient, writings, you just see people kind of, fantasizing about things, and I think fantasy has just been such an important part. I mean, one could argue there's a couple of really globally accepted important books out there that are fantasy, but but at this, and the thing is, so the responsibility with the art stuff, and and this is something that I was talking to Nadia from Pussy Riot over the last couple of weeks, is this idea of art as activism or for social change. And the reality is that I think that more artists need to get into the space of exploring future scenarios, because there is a place for all of us. There's a place for depicting the future, the future that seems kind of almost real in terms of just close predictions. There's a way of showcasing the dystopian future of what could happen, and the fact that we should be aware of it. There's place for creating alternative ideas which people have never thought about, or just a positive future. So there is an option to do all of these things. And of course when sci-fi becomes real life from, you know, in a negative way, and that things are catching up and these things seem kind of dystopian, it is frightening. And, you know, but at the same time, you know, I know just from personal experience being on panels and stuff, it's like, you know, majority of people working in the futurist field are trying to understand how to create things that have more, that, you know, are just in, like, from the ground up, have different values. And you know, I can't I might be like a good visual reference for that, but I also definitely don't represent like the entire scope of that or post disability, you know. And I think it's really important. But, you know, also I think that genuinely one of the most positive things that I have found over the past like 5 years since we spoke is the idea of how much community of innovators, for example, and, you know, or people who are just working on sort of futuristic concepts for our culture, you know, how much desire there is to connect with other people and not make these decisions alone. You know, of course, there are really terrible examples out right now, you know, with huge companies that just seem to be impenetratable in their destruction of you know, of planet and everything. But there is also a lot of desire to kind of be able to create impact in a positive way. And honestly, like you know, one of the things, you know, I was talking about the prototype video kind of recently with somebody, and you know, always kind of how there is a, you know, it's a fairly aggressive visual, right? It's a very some people find it kind of scary or whatever. And the thing is that one of the things that I've found, actually, especially kind of living in the States and feeling, you know, the political tension and the things that have been happening, is that, you know, the force of kind of fear and sort of anything bad, right? It's generally it's so aggressive. It's so aggressive. It's like an arrow just pierces through, you know, and it has this kind of, the delivery message is very aggressive, and it has this kind of specific thing. And when we think about positive impact on the humans or the world, you know, it's like this idea that, you know, it needs to be soft and it needs to be somehow presented in this kind of glowing bowl, you know. And I, over the years, just I've been kind of questioning. I'm like, why is my work so kind of aggressive, you know? And I realized that, you know, I think that we have to be aggressively positive these days. Is this, you know, and the counterpoint to the negative politics that are happening in the world and the bad things that are happening in the world, you know, is essentially, a lot of it is just actually just artists and people who are creating the counter movement to that by, you know, making sure that the alternative messages are heard really like loud and clear. And that was the principle, you know, with prototype, is that, you know, it has a feeling of, you know, clearing the stage for the message that I'm about to deliver, that, you know, whatever misconceptions anyone had about what it's like to not have a biological limb, just wrong, simply just poof, disappear, you know. So I think that honestly, it's in my opinion, this is going to be the most powerful time for art and creation. And I know that it feels really hard and it doesn't sort of feel like that's going to be the case. But I really feel that that is the case because, this kind of collective suffering that we've all been undergoing, there's a sense that, people's feelings and motivations are really woken up. They're awake, and I think that people are going to be and are creating and talking about issues that are really important to them in a completely new way. It's like somehow over a sort of a spell, the amount of people who are becoming artists with activism angle have just, I just feel like they just sprouted out of nowhere, which is amazing, because it just, the situation reminded us that, there are important human qualities and issues and feelings, and all of that stuff is real, and you can't be constantly kind of removing it from culture that's here. It has to be present. So I feel very rejuvenated in that way, and I really feel it kind of around me at the moment. So who knows?
Well, that's the fundamental power of art, isn't it? It must be so weird for you to see your dreams, your concepts, your imaginings bleed into reality, have such cultural impact on how we think about cyborg bodies or posthuman bodies or post-disability bodies. But the reality is, by creating these images, they can really affect the future. And it's always fascinated me how Black Mirror was originally a noun. It was a name for a TV series, but it has so quickly become a verb. People look at things out in present reality and go, oh, that's a little bit Black Mirror. That's a little bit Black Mirror. So these artistic ideas, these provocations, these presentations through a visual, through sound, through film, whatever it is, they truly can affect the present and generate a certain type of future. That's the impotence of a futurist. They just provocate and try and predict what may actually come to pass. You're more a propagandist. You create what may come to pass. And then the power of self-fulfilling prophecy kind of just allows that to happen naturally. That's an incredible power that artists have, isn't it?
Absolutely. And, I was just reading an article yesterday, about how, everybody working in design is essentially a futurist. And this, it's, and this is more of like a kind of basic analogy, but, if you can imagine it, like, the chances are it's probably possible. Like, this is as simple as that. And, and I think that, the most powerful thing you can do is to actually create the thing that you imagine, and that is exactly what's been happening with some of the work pieces that we've been making, and it's and honestly, I think that that has been the most sort of disturbing kind of an awe feeling for me. Because, but I really cultivated my imagination in my darkest time when I was in hospital, and I didn't have an outlet. I didn't, and so I just, I felt the realness of my inner world. I felt the realness of my imagination, and I felt the realness of, and the kind of the power of, when I generated a certain idea, how actually, that's like giving birth to something, and it might take 5 years or 10 years or 20 years for that to become a reality, but it's possible, and that is probably the only kind of responsibility angle that I think is important, because people with positive thoughts and with negative have imagination, and so therefore different things get kind of born into the world, and this is the biggest challenge for all of the digital and technology aspects of our culture that we're creating right now, is that people are starting to question. It's like, so the algorithm is actually just a computer representation of the person that created the algorithm. Who's that person? What was their thoughts on life and other people? What is it that they gave birth to, and why is it dictating like so many people's things? So it's the biggest problem that's happening is that people are underestimating their own power.
Yeah.
But that's like, I mean, we could talk about it for ages, but it does ultimately feed into the illusion of everything being really separate and not being this connected ecosystem. So and I feel like the people that I'm around a lot, do recognize that it is an ecosystem, and do recognize the need for sharing ideas and coming together and being able to impact things, from an intentional point of view, which is, it's hard.
That's what fascinates me about the aesthetics of some of the NFT artwork, especially Beeple's artwork, which really just feels like culture vomiting a bunch of references onto a virtual environment and creating these very weird hybrid versions of Trump plus Toy Story plus Disney plus environments of war plus the flags from Korea. There's these just weird images that we're beginning to see, which come from, I guess, a cultural confusion about how malleable reality is. And it does feel like, and forgive me if maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but it does feel like your work is slowly heading towards this creation of reality. And I've with my tongue firmly in my cheek, I keep calling it the Modesta verse. That it feels like the next step for you is to really start exploring how much of reality you really can grok. Because at one point it felt like you were going into a metamorphosis of human instrument hybrid, but it actually feels like now virtuality provides so much more opportunity. So I wonder, how are you thinking about the virtual space, and when you're early on sort of cognizing and creating these avatars, are you thinking about them in relationship to your body now? Will the Viktoria Modesta avatar be a bipedal entity? Will it be a thripedal entity? Does it necessarily need a body as traditionally understood human bodies are? Could it be something entirely different that you're creating?
What drives me is a more bigger fundamental question, right? Of how do the borders of our sort of post-physical identity really like stretch? Like, how far does it go? And that's been something that's been on my mind for the longest time. And so obviously I've been exploring that with the physical reality, and there is still so much more to explore. I can't ignore the digital space, because I feel like ultimately the whole concept of extending yourself digitally is a form of an identity prosthetic. It's a digital prosthetic. It's a so I'm interested in exploring it from that perspective. And what does this digital prosthetic mean to me? What is it for? What does it do? Does it have different qualities? Does it is it out there so it can do other things that I can't do or want to do? So I intend to do a series of projects around digital identity that are very nicely supported by conversations around it with different people from different sort of fields, so to say, because that's what I think needs to happen right now. I think we need to delve into it, and there is so much possibility for just pure entertainment and which you never have to forget that, because I do believe that kind of somewhere between entertainment, a cool demo, and some sort of like a social impact thing is really kind of where I'm at, because if you're gonna spend, thousands of dollars on making something happen, like, it needs to have like a three-pronged effect at the very least. But also it's important to say that, obviously Beeple is a very specific example, and I feel like one of the reasons why people are resonating with some of the NFT work at the moment is that it is such a, it's a crude, but it's a very accurate description of how they've been feeling, and there is a kind of emotional resonance that's happening, and that is very important. I think the emotional impact and emotional value is potentially the thing that is being captured with this NFT concept. And I can't say that it's purely that, because I think there is some work out there where you just kind of go, well, I don't really know.
Well, it feels like everybody is trying to enter in that space of being a creator inside of the virtual world, and because the tools are so accessible. And I'm thinking specifically of Instagram, but unlike you, who has such a healthy relationship with the separation between what is artistic output and what is the real Viktoria, Instagram influencers have a much more difficult relationship with how they generate and create their realities. And we're beginning to see all of these Instagram posts, and we always have since they've released the app because it has filters, but increasingly so, the quality of manipulation is getting higher and higher. And I'm not talking about the manipulation of the person's skin or the manipulation of that person's body, but also the manipulation of the reality around them, where they're photoshopping clouds into the sky, and pink clouds at that. They're photoshopping birds, or photoshopping rainbows, or all of these versions of how they wish that image looked. And these realities that they're putting out in the world are being sold as a form of realness, but in actual fact they're purely fictional. And then you have to contend with the sadness that comes from an inability to live in a world that has this Disney-like aesthetic. So I guess my question is, and I know you've worked a little bit in this space, how do people carefully navigate these virtual worlds so that they don't have to deal with the sense of loss? How are they able to interact and create these things while maintaining their wellness and well-being? Because the real problem of some of these digital creators is there's a sadness that their lives aren't as beautiful and aesthetically pleasing as the images and the presentations of themselves that they put online. So I guess, how do we mediate that?
I mean, to be honest, I feel like it's the, and this comes to like, could you be anyone else that you want on the internet?
Well,
when
yes,
you have
but
the capability.
you can be, but when you realize you can't actually be that person in reality, you can't always have the smile on, and you can't always have the perfect hair, and the sun isn't always shining. It might be in your virtual representation of yourself on Instagram, but when it comes to the reality, you've got the bills and the taxes that you got to pay. You've got to deal with family issues that you may have. There's a multitude of things that are hidden in this process of creating a virtual.
Absolutely super hidden. I mean, it's just, there's a couple of things, like from just the perspective of, impact of seeing images like that to other people. I think that not having an idea that things have been digitally manipulated is really not great. For example, one of the things I love about Instagram filters myself is that, most of the time you can clearly see what filter the person has used, and you're aware. You're like, that, that person probably just woke up and they don't have their hair and makeup on, and they clearly are using their filter. You can try that filter as well. You can really clearly understand. And I think that there is a certain, and this is what I believe, I'm really hoping that with this idea of kind of valuing digital artwork in any way might happen, is this idea of understanding what is digitally enhanced and what is clearly being worked on, and what is a digital fantasy, because I think that people selling fantasy as real life is dangerous. It's not, it just simply, it sets like just very unrealistic expectations, and of course that's not great, but the point of just like in a a personal sort of world that you kind of the issue that you brought up is that this is why I believe we have the sooner we start integrating and understanding the kind of amount of care that we need for ourselves in the physical world and the digital world, and the more clearly we're going to start talking about it, the better it's going to be, because you can't you can't make up for the lack of unresolved emotional issues that are happening in your real life with the digital world. Like, you just can't. You might at some point have some sort of moments where you feel like it's alleviating something, but you can't. I personally, the deeper I got into my fantasy work, for the past 5-6 years, the deeper I got into my work with psychology, with spirituality, with working through issues with my body, just understanding muscle memory and trauma memory, your nervous system and things like that. So, for me, I've been exploring it very hand in hand because, of course, there's a chance that, this digital space is just going to be populated with a lot of us with unresolved emotional issues and egos and fragments of ourselves that feel like, oh, well, we'll leave the other parts behind because this part is having a really great time, but but I don't really know that that's any different from like real life, like people get absolutely obsessed with their work, or substances, or certain life behaviors which just make them feel like they're escaping from who they really are. And the biggest thing that I've learned after sort of realizing how the process of why Viktoria Modesta as this almost sort of supernatural character was born, was realizing that nothing will substitute or bring you peace until you have and sort of developed this intimate, accepting relationship with who you are here, because you can definitely grow and change, and like everything is malleable. All the things that you think you're into might be an illusion, but there is a sense, the relationship that you develop with yourself is just fundamental. And the only positive thing that I kind of found with this sort of like clubhouse chats and stuff is I'm actually noticing how people are different, or maybe them, or are being themselves, or maybe aren't being themselves, but there's a certain kind of truth that starts to come through in those conversations that's kind of, I don't know, it feels fresh, it feels different to typing. I have to say there is something that feels different to typing. And I think that I have to tell you, so my positive note, right, about this whole situation, my positive note is that people are on a mass level starting to experience how there is an inner them and then there's the physical them, and how their body could be sitting in exactly the same room for most of the day, and then their inner world, you're just having a whole life. I mean, you're just, there's so many things that are happening. You might as well be, in, sometimes in a combat situations when there's like problems happening or positive social situations. And I think that collectively people are starting to go through experience that I had with my amputation of this feeling of physical self and the non-physical self. And I personally think that can only yield good things, because for me it's been like transcending it. To me, it's helped me see past so many weird delusionary schemes that are happening in the world, and like standards and judgments. So I think that we are kind of taking like a little bit of evolutionary leap right now somehow, and um, I think it's just happening, and I don't really know that kind of how we the kind of perspective that we have in it. I don't really know that this is going to change it. I think it's happening,
Well, I think, Victoria, you got it right before anybody else in a funny sort of way, because you understood that the way to be honest is to create the character, to be honest about the fact that you can create multiplicities of identities and they don't have to have a coherent narrative. They can have divergent narratives. And that feels like almost what you're getting at with the avatar. It's like, how much of it do I need to be responsible for once I create it and allow it to live in the world? And the same with, the image of Viktoria Modesta, the post-human bionic pop star. How much do I need to be responsible for that version of my identity now that it's out in the world? And at the end of the day, the origin that is creating these different provocations and different versionings of oneself is the only thing that you need to make sure that you spend the spiritual and mental time on, to ensure that it is healthy to produce these artistic provocations. And the way in which you maintain that, I guess, mental health is by being honest with the fact that you have no desire to preserve these things as soon as they're out in the world. That is just a version. That's just a version. You can be very laissez-faire with the way through which you present yourself out in the world. There's a Italian science fiction book. I can't remember the year of it, but it's called 1,000, 100,000. And it's about a guy who goes crazy because he suddenly realizes that his mother's understanding of who he is different from his understanding of who he is different from his friend's understanding of who he is different from, the guy in the coffee shop's understanding of who he is. And by trying to control all these things, trying to control the multiplicity of our identity, that's where the madness comes from. There's so much more fun, as you've done, with just relinquishing that and allowing it to have its own life out in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I have to tell you that, there is no easy way to have that experience, and I think that, the breaking of the illusion, of like feeling really, really certain of who you are or like what you represented, the breaking of that illusion for anybody. I mean, some people, I think, that can't actually handle it if they're not fully prepared. And I think this is why the pandemic was extremely hard for some people, because all of a sudden nobody was telling them what time to get up and what time they have to be somewhere, and, there's a certain advantage to being a kind of an entrepreneur where you feel responsibility of the fact that no one's going to come and get you and tell you how to be at any point. And, you really kind of very uncomfortably realize exactly what your responsibility is and exactly who you are and stuff. And, so there isn't an easy way to do it. But honestly, when it does happen, it is it is great. And, and I came to a certain form of madness too. I think in 2019, being the face of Rolls-Royce and being, the the Bionic showgirl in Paris and doing all of the things, I kind of was just like, okay, I was like, I feel like I have lost the control. I feel like I've lost the control I've lost kind of the certain freedom where, I've created this thing, and it just so happens that I physically have to go and fulfill that thing's mission, right? So it wasn't comfortable and it wasn't great, but also, I was like, okay, I was like, well, the only way is to, it's just a matter of time for me to be able to step back and to be able to think about, okay, well, we've learned all these things from the experience. What do we do now? So it's and it's very different to just kind of alter ego too. It's but I think that I really genuinely hope that people during this pandemic have had the chance to think about what is important to them outside of who they feel they need to be to other people or in the world. I think that the more kind of understanding there is about that, one of the most important things that happened to me when I joined, when I became a fellow at MIT Media Lab, was the kind of sort of coaching that I received that was around making you understand that if you don't understand your core values, if you don't follow and structure your life around your core values, like, you are in for a miserable life, and you are literally never going to be able to fulfill your potential. You're just going to just be lying to yourself, right? So that was one of the most important things. It's like, does is what I'm doing right now ultimately serve the things that I believe in and what I, and through that method, you are able to kind of create, there's so much hype around authenticity. What does that mean? But there is an ability to be authentic to yourself, and it might be shaped by the experiences that have happened to you and your conditioning to a certain point, but it is still authentic. And so many people don't actually even get to that point. This is feeling you need to be doing things for a certain way, and it's not everybody has that privilege to. Not everybody has the privilege to do that, but I think that ultimately, that is the biggest lesson that I'm like taking to, the future work that I'm doing with me is keeping the values that I know are going to be, going to yield longevity for me and my interest and my passion, because it just means that I might be great doing certain things. I might have some specific skills, but that doesn't always mean that that's like your life mission.
Yeah. Although you've hit on something there, which is about collaboration. Viktoria Modesta, media cyborg, is not the product of one individual. It might be represented by the singular artist, but in actual fact, all of your work is thanks to and because of the way in which you collaborate with so many individuals, from Sophie de Oliveira Barata to the ARC folk who helped you create some of your limbs. I mean, can you just talk a little bit about how that collaborative process, I guess, is the thing that really does keep you honest when creating these external identities, these artistic products that you're putting into the world?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you mention that, because most projects have such a big collaboration team behind them. So, I mean, sometimes I kind of think that part of my job really is sort of curating that team, Because and you know and I think that auditioning and curating the team is just so important, you know, because successfully doing that, it means that, you know, so it means that you don't have to check anyone along the way. Pretty much is that, you know, people just kind of come onto the same page and everybody has the same goal. And I mean, I don't talk about this too much, but you know, one of the key components of a lot of the projects that are public out there has been bringing together um, teams from vastly different industries together. You know, bringing in hackers and engineers and scientists and people that are working with different mediums to traditional kind of entertainment industry, and then bridging them together. And you know, most of my work is a result of you know, it's like an octopus brain. It's like, you know, this is the result of a lot of people's intentions and creative ideas together. And um, so you know, so from that perspective, it's like I think that, you know, a lot of there's a certain, you know, there's a certain kind of parameters that I guess I keep, you know, as a performing artist, because and I usually give those parameters really clearly. You know, these are the parameters that we're working on, and this is our goal. Let's just make something happen. You know, but at the same time, I guess, you know, a lot of these visuals are representation of a larger community and a larger thought process that's happening, you know, and finding like-minded people from
Yeah.
both of those spectrums is very interesting. I mean, and for sure, one of the things that I'm very interested, um, you know, going forward is actually establishing um, that community or representation of that community beyond kind of work. Just, you know, that's just my personal work, and that is something I'm really passionate about and that I'm working on at the moment, because I think that the conversation about the future, and especially the future of human culture and lifestyle, needs to be really broad. And that's and I'm sure I'm going to hit you up at some point about that too. But you know, I think that I genuinely think that there needs to be like a new movement of some sort of like-minded people being able to discuss that, because that really has been the success behind my work, is being able to, you know, come together with creative people that share, you know, my vision and the feeling about the future. So
Well, that's why it's futures, because these things are plural. There's a multitude of influences. It's important to give space to those influences, see what happens when those influences cross-pollinate, and see what ideas they birth out into the world, and then how those ideas can then reflect on the world and become actual in either future science or technology. And that point, I have to ask, what technology are you most excited about? What can we next expect from the Modestaverse?
oh, I mean, there's a lot. There's a lot of. I mean, I'm really excited about a lot of different things at the moment. I mean, from medical devices turning into lifestyle devices, that's like a major thing. You know, I think us kind of assisted with technology in a interesting way. It's like I'm just watching that entire space right now. You know, of when technology is able to be in smart fashion and things like that. I think that's really fascinating. Um, I think that actually everything, now that I'm thinking about it, everything evolves around kind of the connection with the more sort of hidden data within your body, and the outputs of that, from a creative sense, from a medical sense, from all kinds of sense. I think that, you know, elegantly um, having a communication between your physical body and technology kind of really fascinates me. That's so I'm looking at all of it, from I guess I'm waiting for the moment for the senses to be more sophisticated, because external senses are kind of limited at the moment, and anything internal seems kind of like Frankenstein vibes. So I think that it's I'm very kind of closely watching the more sort of elegant ways of how we can mostly just spend less time staring at screens as well. So talking about hyperrealism, I actually believe that is what's going to happen, is that the more that because everything is just happening through our eyes at the moment, and I genuinely believe that we will be able to connect with technology in a more seamless way, so that we're spending less time just staring at screens and staring straight into the metaverse. And I think that there's the metaverse is our imagination, and there's a visual representation of our imagination that's happening. It's being developed so strongly right now, and I genuinely believe that it can become sophisticated enough for it to be overlaid our reality, and just having this extra dimension exist that isn't just in a box. And that would be really cool. That's the thing that I'm looking forward to.
It's about generating those feedback loops. I mean, that goes back to cybernetics.
Exactly.
The real fascination was the feedback loop between the data that the body can create, the digital environment, how that can then affect the body and how it generates data. I mean, just staring at a shiny glowing rectangle can create a form of anxiety, and to be able to capture that, feed that back, and do something interesting and performative with that seems like the place we should be starting, with the body as a body of knowledge, as a form of technology in its own right, and exploring what we can do with that raw material. The raw material that you said is the last thing that we actually really truly own.
Yeah, exactly. Feedback loops. It is all about that. So I think that you've even though you don't know, but what you've said is it's exactly where we're at right now. I'm at right now.
Well, I hope we're going to get some interesting feedback on this interview. And I just have to say thank you, Viktoria, for being a guest on the Futures podcast.
Great. Awesome. Thanks for having me.